The city lights shimmered below, a vast, glittering tapestry that felt, on nights like this, like an extension of my own domain. I sat at the head of the boardroom table, the polished surface reflecting the cool precision of the room, and perhaps, of myself. At 36, the name Anya Sharma was spoken with respect, sometimes awe, and I suspected, a healthy dose of fear in the corridors of power. A multi-billion-dollar acquisition hung in the balance, the culmination of months of careful planning, anticipation, and relentless pressure. I spoke only when necessary, my voice low, even, every syllable weighted. There was no room for hesitation, no tolerance for error. The men and women across from me, titans in their own right, shifted under my gaze, their usual bluster muted. They knew I saw the angles they missed, anticipated the moves they hadn't even conceived. The ink was drying on the contract, a formality, a final surrender. A flicker of triumph, sharp and clean, pierced through my practiced composure. And in that fleeting instant, a phantom image flashed behind my eyes. A younger me, small and trembling, shrinking from a cruel gaze in a room that smelled of old money and decay. The contrast was a jolt. That girl. She was a ghost I carried, a shadow that fueled the very fire that brought me here. The fortress I had built around myself was formidable, impenetrable. This empire was my shield, my weapon, my proof that they hadn't broken me. My network was extensive, my eyes and ears everywhere. News of the old guard, the families who still clung to tradition and inherited power, filtered through to me constantly. I knew the Lee family was facing challenges. Modern markets were a brutal, unforgiving landscape, and their reliance on outdated methods, on influence rather than innovation, was showing cracks. My own company, Sharma Enterprises, was a disruptive force, lean and agile where they were cumbersome. A report landed on my desk detailing a snag in one of their key development projects. A crucial land parcel needed to complete their flagship. Complex was held by a small company that had just been quietly acquired. My lips curved slightly. The company? A shell I had set up months ago, specifically for this purpose. The name on the report, the one that would reach Madam Lee? Sharma Enterprises. I pictured her face receiving the news. That sharp, imperious frown, the dismissal in her eyes. Anya Sharma, the report would say. I could almost hear her scoff. Impossible. She was insignificant. Yes, I was. Once. The thought brought no pain, only a cold, resolute certainty. That vague irritation she would feel, that tiny, unfamiliar sliver of unease. It was the echo of a ghost she thought she had laid to rest. She wouldn't understand. Not yet. She would see it as a business challenge, a minor irritant. Good. Let her underestimate me. It was how I had survived, how I had learned to strike. Stepping back 10 years felt like plunging into icy water. The grand house. It had loomed before me like a promise, a gateway to a life I hadn't known. I, Anya, from a respectable but modest family, marrying into the esteemed Lee lineage. I arrived, filled with a naive hope, an eagerness to belong. But the air inside was stale, heavy with unspoken rules and a chilling silence. Madam Lee. She wasn't loud. Her cruelty was far more insidious. It was in the tilt of her head, the slight curl of her lip, the way her eyes would sweep over me, finding every flaw, every perceived inadequacy. Anya, she would say, her voice soft, almost regretful. Your spoon. You hold it like a peasant. Or, to a relative, loud enough for me to hear but framed as a joke. Our Anya means well, bless her heart, but some things simply cannot be taught. The house itself seemed to conspire with her. The vast empty rooms echoed my solitude. The valuable antiques felt cold and unwelcoming, guarded by silent, observant staff who learned quickly not to meet my eye. I was a foreign object in this perfectly curated museum, constantly being measured and found wanting. Every day was a performance I failed. Every interaction a subtle erosion of my self-worth. It wasn't a home. It was a stage for my humiliation. A gilded cage where the bars were made of expectation, and the air was thick with judgment. The subtle digs sharpened into pointed daggers. The corrections became outright accusations. I was denied basic comforts, given grueling, pointless tasks while others idled. All under the guise of training or integrating me into the family. Madame Lee was a maestro of manipulation. She maintained her perfect facade for the outside world, the picture of a gracious, elegant matriarch. But behind closed doors, the performance shifted. She would humiliate me in front of family members, making cruel remarks about my appearance or intelligence, watching with chilling satisfaction as I struggled to maintain composure. I was starved, not just of food, but of kindness, of human connection. My husband? He was a ghost himself, present but absent, too weak or too scared to stand up to his mother. The isolation was profound. I remember one evening, a relative's birthday dinner. I had accidentally spilled a drop of sauce. Madame Lee didn't raise her voice. Instead, she stopped the conversation, smiled thinly, and said, "Anya, perhaps you should eat in the kitchen. It seems you're not quite ready for the dining table yet?" The stifled snickers from some, the averted gazes of others, the shame burned hotter than any physical pain. But the worst was when she forced me to kneel before her, ostensibly to apologize for some imagined offense, just to show her I knew my place. Looking up at her, seeing the cold power in her eyes, as I knelt there, broken and stripped of dignity, that image is seared into my soul. She reduced me to nothing. There wasn't one single cataclysmic event. It was a slow, agonizing erosion, each day a fresh layer of pain and humiliation. It was the cold nights spent locked out of my room because I hadn't finished a task to her arbitrary standard. It was being denied a doctor when I was truly ill, told I was seeking attention. It was overhearing her discussing my future, not as a person, but as a pawn to be moved in her endless game of family politics, perhaps married off again if it suited her. The realization struck me with chilling clarity. I would not survive this. I would wither and die, physically or mentally, within these walls. There would be no rescue, no change. My spirit, though battered, refused to accept that fate. A raw, primal instinct for survival surged through the despair. The fear of staying, of being consumed, finally outweighed the terror of leaving. It was a brutal calculus, life or death. In that moment, huddled in the cold, dark corner of a room that felt like a prison cell, a decision solidified within me. I had to leave, no matter the cost. The escape was not glamorous, not defiant. It was quiet, desperate, fueled by pure terror and the faint, fragile flicker of hope. Under the cloak of pre-dawn darkness, heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, I slipped out of the grand house. A small bag clutched in my hand, containing little more than worn clothes and a few crumpled bills I had painstakingly saved or found. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. Scaling a wall, slipping through a gap in a fence, the memory is blurred by adrenaline. Stepping onto the cold, indifferent city street felt both liberating and terrifying. I was utterly alone, adrift in a world that didn't know me, didn't care. The risk of being caught, dragged back, facing Madame Lee's inevitable wrath, was immense. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. But with each shaky step I took away from that house, away from that life, the air felt a little easier to breathe. The concrete beneath my worn shoes was hard and unforgiving, a stark contrast to the deceptive luxury I had left behind. I was vulnerable, exposed, but for the first time in years, I was also truly free. The first months were a brutal test. I existed on the fringes, in the underbelly of the city. Menial jobs that barely paid enough for food and a roof over my head in shared, dilapidated rooms. Exhaustion was my constant companion. There were moments, late at night, alone with my fear and the gnawing emptiness in my stomach, when the despair would threaten to consume me entirely. The memory of Madame Lee's contemptuous smile, the feeling of being utterly worthless would flood back. But then another memory would surface, that spark of defiance in the dark corner, the decision to live. That fueled a different kind of hunger. Not just for food, but for stability, for safety, for a future where I would never, ever be at the mercy of someone else's cruelty again. I watched the world around me, observing how power worked, how people built lives, how money flowed. I was a sponge, absorbing every lesson the harsh streets and my low-paying jobs could teach me. My rise was not a sudden leap, but a slow, deliberate climb, hand over hand, forged in fire. I worked multiple jobs, saved obsessively. Every spare moment was spent studying, in libraries, in cheap cafes, devouring books on finance, business, anything that could give me an edge. I was driven by a single burning purpose, to acquire the kind of strength that couldn't be taken away. I learned to mask my past, to project a quiet competence that belied my difficult circumstances. I found unexpected help, a kind librarian who saw my potential, a small business owner who gave me a chance, recognizing my relentless work ethic. I learned the language of business, the strategies of negotiation, the cold calculus of the market. The resilience that was forced upon me became my greatest asset. The ability to endure, to adapt, to see opportunities where others saw only obstacles. I was building myself, piece by painstaking piece, into something strong, something unbreakable. The desire for security was paramount, but simmering beneath it, a colder, harder resolve began to form. The desire to ensure that the architect of my suffering would one day witness what she had tried to destroy, resurrected and standing tall. Years bled into each other. The small business I started, born from necessity and fueled by tireless work, began to grow. I had a knack for seeing value where others didn't, for making strategic decisions that paid off. My reputation for being sharp, trustworthy, and relentlessly focused spread. Sharma Enterprises, initially just a name on a few local deals, began to appear on bigger contracts, in wider markets. I was building not just wealth, but leverage. And as I built my own world, I kept a distant, watchful eye on the one I had escaped. I subscribed to industry reports, followed news about the major players, including the Lee family. I saw their successes, their failures, the subtle shifts in their power structure. Their reliance on tradition, their resistance to change, was creating vulnerabilities. I studied their assets, their debts, the tangled web of their holdings. The idea took root, solidifying from a vague hope into a concrete plan. I wasn't just building a new life. I was building the means to settle an old score, not with violence, but with the very tools of the world Madame Lee understood: power, wealth, and undeniable success. The foundation was laid. The target was in sight. My office is a sanctuary of control. From here, high above the city, I can see the world unfold. 10 years, a decade spent cultivating the steel that now defines me. The time for waiting was over. I had amassed the resources, built the network, honed the skills. My target was clear: not the entire Lee family, but the very source of their enduring, poisonous power, Madame Eleanor Lee herself. Her control was rooted not just in wealth, but in the legacy she had built, the respect, or fear, she commanded in the business world, the perception of invincibility. I wouldn't just take her money. I would dismantle the edifice she had constructed piece by piece in a way that forced her to witness her own undoing. I had spent years studying the intricacies of the Lee Empire, finding the weak points, the over-leveraged assets, the dependencies on outdated practices. My plan was complex, a multi-pronged attack designed to cause maximum disruption to her core holdings and leave her exposed. It was a corporate siege, a battle waged with contracts, acquisitions, and information. This wasn't blind revenge, it was calculated justice, delivered on a scale she could not ignore. The initial stages of my plan were designed to be subtle, almost invisible to anyone not specifically looking. Sharma Enterprises made a series of strategic acquisitions, companies that seemed unrelated to the Lee family on the surface, but which held key positions in their supply chains, distribution networks, or proprietary technology. These moves were reported as smart business, lauded in financial journals. They strengthened my position, expanded my reach, and, crucially, began to subtly constrain the Lee family's operations without triggering alarm bells. I imagined Madam Lee glancing at the reports, seeing my company's name, perhaps a flicker of irritation. Sharma again, she might say. Ambitious, these newcomers. She wouldn't see the pattern, the deliberate targeting. She was too used to looking down, too confident in her own untouchable position. She saw a competitor. She didn't see the hand reaching out from the past to dismantle her present. Good. Let her remain blind for a little longer. Each seemingly innocuous move was a tightening of the noose I was slowly, meticulously, placing around the neck of her empire. The phase of subtle moves was over. Now, the pressure escalated. Sharma Enterprises launched a bold public bid to acquire a company that was not just related to the Lee family's operations, but absolutely vital to their future growth. Or perhaps, I used my market influence to manipulate prices in a way that hit one of their core commodities hard. Another move might involve strategically acquiring a significant portion of their debt, giving me leverage they couldn't ignore. These actions were undeniable. They hit the Lee family's bottom line, generated negative press, and caused visible discomfort in the market. Madam Lee couldn't dismiss me as just a competitor anymore. She knew my name now, linked irrevocably to their setbacks. I pictured her rage, her frustration. She would fight back, of course. She would use every tool at her disposal, legal challenges, calling in old favors, spreading rumors. But her tools were blunt and outdated compared to mine. My legal team was ready for every maneuver, my public image was unassailable, and my network extended beyond her sphere of influence. Her attempts to retaliate would feel like a desperate flailing against a solid wall. My countermoves were swift and precise. For every legal challenge Madam Lee threw at me, I had a more solid defense, a countersuit ready. For every rumor she tried to spread, my public relations amplified my reputation for integrity and success. The pressure on the Lee family became relentless. Their financial reports showed strain. Key deals collapsed because potential partners were wary of doing business with a company under such sustained attack, an attack clearly orchestrated by the rising power of Sharma Enterprises. Madam Lee's control, once absolute, began to visibly fray. News leaked of infighting within the family, of panic among their executives. I heard whispers from within her circle. Her temper was volatile, her judgment erratic. The mask was slipping. The empire she had guarded so fiercely was being dismantled from the outside, brick by strategic brick. She was losing control, and the source of her undoing was a name she thought she had buried 10 years ago. The tension was building towards the inevitable confrontation, a moment I had spent a decade preparing for. I had tightened the net, closed off all avenues of escape. My strategic moves had backed Madam Lee into a corner from which there was only one way out, a direct confrontation with me. I manipulated circumstances to ensure our paths would cross. In a public, high-stakes setting, a major industry conference, a televised business forum, a critical shareholder meeting where her leadership was on the line. I ensured my presence was not only necessary, but unavoidable for her. She couldn't send a subordinate. She had to face me herself. The air crackled with anticipation in the weeks leading up to the event. Everyone in the business world knew the story, or at least the public version of the corporate war between Sharma Enterprises and the Lee family. They saw the financial numbers, the strategic brilliance of my attacks. They didn't know the personal history, the decade of pain that fueled my every move. But they would witness the outcome. I was calm, almost detached, in the days before the confrontation. Every detail was planned, every possible reaction anticipated. I wasn't nervous. I was ready. Ready to face the woman who had tried to break me and force her to acknowledge that she had failed. The auditorium was hushed, expectant. Madame Eleanor Lee stood on the stage, poised to deliver what was meant to be a defiant speech about her family's enduring strength. I sat in the front row, a solitary figure of calm authority amidst the murmurs. The tension was palpable. Then, my plan reached its climax. As Madame Lee began to speak, screens around the room, which were supposed to display her presentation, flickered and changed. They displayed financial figures, complex diagrams, irrefutable data points, the result of my meticulously orchestrated maneuvers over the past year. They showed the dramatic decline in the Lee family's value, the unsustainable debt, the strategic acquisitions that had crippled their operations. Then, a final slide appeared, simple and devastating. Details of a binding, non-retractable agreement that transferred a vital, foundational asset of the Lee Empire directly to Sharma Enterprises, an agreement Madame Lee herself had signed, blind to its true implications within the web I had woven. Madame Lee's voice faltered. Her eyes widened, scanning the screens, then snapping to me. Her carefully constructed facade shattered in an instant. Disbelief, raw fury. And then, as the numbers sank in, a dawning, sickening realization of total, absolute defeat. Whispers erupted in the audience, rising to a shocked murmur. Her speech became a series of choked sounds, a desperate, pathetic attempt to deny the undeniable reality unfolding before her. She stumbled over her words, her hands trembling. She was trapped, exposed, her empire dissolving before the very eyes of the world she cared about most. I met her gaze across the room. My expression was calm, unwavering. There was no joy, no triumphant smirk, just a quiet, profound acknowledgement. You tried to destroy me. Look at what you created instead. She knew. In that moment, stripped of her power, her status, her control, she knew. The proud head, which had always looked down on me, didn't physically bow, but her will, her spirit, her entire world knelt before the power of the woman she had abused. It was the absolute, irreversible surrender of someone who had lost everything. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The news of the Lee family's financial collapse spread like wildfire. Investigations were launched into the irregularities Anya's actions had brought to light. Allies who had flocked to Madame Lee when she was powerful now scattered, unwilling to be tainted by the scandal. The Lee Empire, built on outdated structures and Madame Lee's iron will, crumbled spectacularly. Lawsuits piled up. Assets were seized. The grand house, the symbol of their legacy and the site of my suffering, was inevitably put on the market. Madame Lee disappeared from public life, a disgraced figure whose name became synonymous with ruin. Her son, weak and feckless, was left to preside over the ashes of their former glory, utterly helpless against the storm. The fall was total, a stark public lesson in the impermanence of power built on cruelty. I stood on the balcony of my penthouse once more, the city lights stretching out before me. I had done it. Madame Lee was brought low, her empire dismantled, her authority shattered. There was a quiet satisfaction, a sense of profound completion. The debt had been paid, the scales balanced. The justice I had sought, in a form the law could never fully deliver, was achieved. But peace? Did I feel peace? The scars of the past remained, etched onto my soul. The years of fear, the hunger, the loneliness, they were a part of me. A quiet ache that even this monumental victory could not erase. The steel that had allowed me to survive and conquer was a part of me now, perhaps too deeply ingrained to ever fully soften. The journey had been solitary, demanding everything I had. Was the victory worth the cost? I didn't have a simple answer. It brought a sense of closure, yes, but the echoes of the past lingered, a constant reminder of where I had come from. Years have passed since Madame Lee's fall. The name Lee is rarely mentioned in the circles where it once commanded respect. Madame Lee lives in quiet obscurity, stripped of the status and wealth that had defined her and enabled her cruelty. The grand house belongs to a new family now. My own life is one of continued purpose and influence. Sharma Enterprises is a global force, known not just for its aggressive strategy, but increasingly for its ethical practices and philanthropic endeavors. I have used the power I fought so hard to gain in ways that contrast sharply with the abuse I suffered. I support initiatives that protect the vulnerable, that empower those who have been marginalized. The past is still a part of me, a shadow that I acknowledge but no longer allows to define me. I built my fortress, not just to protect myself, but to build a new world, a world where the kind of casual cruelty I experienced cannot thrive unchecked. I rose from the ashes, not just to survive, but to command, forcing the structure that had sought to break me to witness my strength, leaving a changed landscape in my wake. The abused girl is gone. The woman who stands here, shaped by the past but not bound by it, is Anya Sharma.